In the pre-dawn darkness of October 15th, 1923, three men stood in the Green Lawn Cemetery outside Salem, Massachusetts, each holding a shovel, each breathing hard from the work they had just completed. They did not know each other. They had never met. Yet all three had done the exact same thing on the exact same night, driven by the exact same compulsion they could not explain. They had dug up the grave of Eleanor Pembroke, dead for 27 years. What they discovered in that coffin would shatter everything they thought they knew about their family, their past, and the woman who had given birth to them all. The story of the Pembroke family begins not with the living, but with the dead. Eleanor Pembroke died on a bitter February night in 1896, alone in the sprawling Victorian mansion that had been her prison for the final 15 years of her life. The official cause of death was consumption, but those who knew Eleanor whispered of something far darker. She had been a woman of extraordinary beauty and keen intelligence, the daughter of a prominent Boston merchant who had married beneath her station for love. That love, they said, had been her undoing. Her husband, Jeremiah Pembroke, was a man of violent temper and darker appetites. Neighbors in Salem spoke in hushed tones of screams that echoed from the Pembroke house in the dead of night, of Eleanor's increasing isolation, of the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever her husband was near. By 1881, she had been confined to the house entirely, Jeremiah claiming her mind had become unhinged, that she posed a danger to herself and others. What the townspeople did not know was that Eleanor had given birth to 3 sons during her marriage, each born exactly 2 years apart, each taken from her arms within days of their birth. Jeremiah had told her they were stillborn, had shown her tiny coffins, had even allowed her to attend brief private funerals. But Eleanor knew better. In the depths of her confinement, she had heard infant cries echoing through the walls of the mansion, had glimpsed shadowy figures carrying small bundles through the corridors at night. The truth was far more calculated than madness. Jeremiah Pembroke was not merely a violent husband. He was a man obsessed with creating the perfect heir. He believed that children raised away from their mother's influence, trained from infancy in discipline and cruelty, would become the kind of sons he desired, ruthless, ambitious, capable of expanding the family fortune through any means necessary. So he had stolen his own children from Eleanor's arms and sent them away to be raised by different families, each unaware of the other's existence. The first son, born in 1867, was given to a childless couple in Hartford, Connecticut. They named him William and raised him as their own, never speaking of his true origins. The second, born in 1869, went to a farming family in upstate New York, where he grew up as Thomas, believing his adoptive parents were his blood relatives. The third, born in 1871, was placed with a minister's family in Vermont, raised as Jonathan, taught that his birth parents had died in a carriage accident. Each boy grew to manhood, carrying the same distinctive features, the same piercing gray eyes, the same strong jaw, the same inexplicable sense that something vital was missing from their lives. They all suffered from the same recurring nightmare, a dream of a woman's voice calling to them from a great darkness, pleading for them to come home. They all felt drawn to graveyards, spending hours wandering among the headstones, searching for something they could not name. Jeremiah's plan worked, perhaps too well. William became a successful banker in Hartford, known for his ruthless business practices and his ability to foreclose on struggling families without a trace of conscience. Thomas built a shipping empire in New York, notorious for the dangerous conditions aboard his vessels and his willingness to transport cargo others would refuse. Jonathan left the ministry after a scandal involving embezzled church funds and became a lawyer, specializing in helping wealthy men escape the consequences of their crimes. Yet each man felt hollow, incomplete, as though they were actors playing roles that did not truly belong to them. They married, had children of their own, but found no satisfaction in their success. The dreams continued. growing more vivid with each passing year, until by their 50th birthdays, all three were plagued by the same vision every night: a pale woman in white, standing beside an empty grave, her arms outstretched, her mouth moving in words they could not hear. Eleanor, meanwhile, had spent the final years of her life in a fury of grief and determination. Confined to her room, watched constantly by Jeremiah's hired guards, she had nevertheless managed to piece together fragments of the truth. A careless comment from a servant, a letter glimpsed on Jeremiah's desk, whispers overheard through thin walls. Slowly, she had learned that her sons lived, that they had been given new names and new families, that they were growing up believing themselves to be orphans or adopted children. She began to plan her revenge with the methodical precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Using her knowledge of Jeremiah's business affairs, she started leaving clues, tiny hints embedded in legal documents, bank records, property deeds, breadcrumbs that would someday lead her sons back to her. She bribed servants to carry messages, used her jewelry to pay for information about her children's whereabouts, and most importantly, she began to weave a web of psychic connection that would bind her sons to her even after death. Eleanor had always been sensitive to what people in those days called spiritual matters. She could sense things others could not, predict events before they happened, feel the emotions of people miles away. In her desperation and rage, these abilities intensified, focusing into something resembling a curse. She poured all of her maternal love, her anguish, and her thirst for justice into a single overwhelming compulsion that would someday draw her sons back to her. When Eleanor died in 1896, Jeremiah buried her quickly and quietly in Greenlawn Cemetery, choosing a remote corner where few visitors came. He commissioned a simple headstone with no dates, no loving epitaph, just her name carved in stark letters. He believed that with Eleanor's death, his secrets were safe, that his sons would continue their lives never knowing the truth of their origins. But Eleanor's influence did not end with her death. If anything, it grew stronger. The dreams that had plagued her sons since childhood became unbearable after 1896, evolving into waking visions that followed them throughout their days. They began to see her face in mirrors, to hear her voice calling their names in empty rooms, to feel an irresistible pull toward the town of Salem, Massachusetts, though none of them could explain why. William was the first to break. In 1920, at the age of 53, he abandoned his bank in Hartford without warning, leaving behind a bewildered wife and children, and began traveling aimlessly through New England. He told people he was searching for something but could never explain what. His journey inevitably led him to Salem, where he felt a recognition so powerful it brought him to his knees in the town square. Thomas followed 2 years later, driven by dreams so vivid he could no longer distinguish them from reality. He sold his shipping business at a devastating loss and moved to Salem, renting a small apartment near the center of town. Like William, he felt that he had come home to a place he had never seen before, though the two men never encountered each other during their restless wanderings through the old colonial streets. Jonathan was the last to succumb, fighting the compulsion until 1923, when the visions became so overwhelming that he suffered what doctors called a nervous breakdown. He abandoned his law practice and his family, arriving in Salem in early October with nothing but the clothes on his back and an obsessive need to visit every cemetery in the area. What none of the three brothers understood was that Eleanor's psychic influence was building toward a crescendo. Each son's presence in Salem strengthened the connection, creating a supernatural resonance that would culminate on the anniversary of her confinement, the night when Jeremiah had first locked her away from the world 27 years before her death. On October 14, 1923, all three men experienced the same vision with perfect clarity. They saw Eleanor standing beside her grave, no longer the broken woman who had died in captivity, but radiant with otherworldly power. She spoke to each of them in words that bypassed their ears and carved themselves directly into their minds. "My sons," she said, "you have been stolen from me, but I have never stopped loving you. Come to me tomorrow night. Bring shovels, bring lanterns. You will find me where your father buried me, and you will learn the truth he tried so hard to hide. Do not fear what you will find. Fear only what will happen if you do not come." The next evening, October 15th, each brother made his way to Greenlawn Cemetery, drawn by a compulsion stronger than their own will. William arrived first, carrying a shovel borrowed from a gardener and a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows among the headstones. He found Eleanor's grave in the remote corner where Jeremiah had hidden it, guided by an internal compass that led him straight to the worn stone marker. As he began to dig, his movements mechanical and precise, Thomas emerged from the darkness, carrying his own tools. The two men stared at each other across the growing hole, recognition dawning slowly. They had the same eyes, the same jawline, the same hands that gripped their shovels. Without speaking, Thomas joined William in the excavation. Jonathan appeared an hour later, his face gaunt from months of tormented dreams, his lawyer's clothing torn and dirty from his desperate journey to this place. He took one look at the two men digging in the moonlight and knew instantly who they were. The family resemblance was unmistakable, but more than that, he felt the psychic cord that connected all three of them, a bond that had been forged in Eleanor's womb and strengthened by decades of shared nightmares. Together, the three brothers worked in silence, their shovels biting into earth that seemed to part easily before them, as though the grave itself wanted to be opened. The physical labor felt like a ritual, a sacrament they were performing for a mother they had never known but had loved all their lives without understanding why. When their shovels finally struck wood, all three men froze. The sound echoed through the cemetery like a gunshot, and for a moment they questioned what they were doing. But Eleanor's voice rose in their minds, urging them forward, and they pried open the coffin with crowbars Thomas had brought from his former shipping office. What they found inside defied every expectation. Eleanor's body was perfectly preserved, as though she had died yesterday rather than 27 years ago. Her skin was pale but smooth, her dark hair still lustrous, her grey eyes open and staring up at them with an expression of infinite love and infinite sadness. She was dressed in a white gown they had never seen, and her hands were folded over a bundle of letters, tied with ribbon. But more shocking than her preservation was what lay beneath her body. The coffin was larger than it appeared from the outside, and Eleanor's form rested on a bed of personal items that told the story of the sons she had lost. There were 3 baby blankets, each embroidered with a different name: William, Thomas, Jonathan, the names she had given them before Jeremiah stole them away. There were locks of hair from each child, kept in separate lockets around her neck. Most heartbreaking of all, there were 3 journals, one for each son, in which Eleanor had written letters throughout their childhood and into their adult years, pouring out all the love and guidance she had been prevented from giving them in life. As the brothers stared into the coffin, Eleanor's eyes seemed to focus on each of them in turn. Her lips moved, though no sound came, but they heard her voice clearly in their minds. "My beloved sons," she whispered, "you have found your way back to me at last. Your father told you I was mad, but it was his cruelty that drove me to the edge of sanity. He stole you from me, raised you as strangers, turned you into men he thought he could control. But love is stronger than his schemes, and now you know the truth." The letters in her hands began to glow with a soft pearl light, and she continued speaking. "Read these when you are ready. They will tell you everything about your births, about your father's plans, about the families who raised you believing they were doing good. None of this is their fault. They loved you as best they could, not knowing they were part of a larger deception. But now you must choose who you will be." Eleanor's form began to shimmer, becoming translucent, though her voice remained clear. "You can continue as you were, living the lives Jeremiah designed for you, successful but hollow, wealthy but empty. Or you can reclaim your true names, your true selves, and become the men I dreamed you could be when I held you as infants. The choice is yours, but know this: as long as you remain apart, as long as you deny your brotherhood, you will never find peace." The three men reached into the coffin simultaneously, each taking one of the journals Eleanor had kept for him. As their fingers touched the aged leather covers, memories flooded back, not their own memories but their mother's, visions of her pregnancy, her joy at each birth, her anguish as Jeremiah tore each baby from her arms. They saw the truth of their father's nature, his cold calculation, his belief that children were tools to be shaped rather than souls to be nurtured. But they also saw Eleanor's fierce love, her refusal to give up hope, her years of patient planning as she waited for the chance to call her sons home. They understood that the compulsion that had brought them to Salem was not a curse, but a mother's love manifested in supernatural form, a psychic umbilical cord that had never been severed. Eleanor's voice began to fade, but her final words rang in their minds like a benediction. "You are my sons, born of love, not of schemes. You have found each other and you have found me. What you do with this knowledge will determine whether my spirit can finally rest. Choose wisely, choose with love, and remember, you are never truly alone as long as you have each other." The light in the coffin dimmed, and Eleanor's form dissolved into particles of silver that rose into the night sky like stars returning to their constellations. The brothers stood in silence, holding their individual journals, feeling the weight of revelation settling around them like a cloak. William, the eldest, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse with emotion as he said, "I remember her voice, not from dreams but from before. When I was very small, I remember being held, being sung to. I thought it was just imagination, but it was her, wasn't it?" Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've been searching my whole life for something I couldn't name. Every woman I met, every business deal I made, nothing ever felt right. But this, standing here with you both, this feels like coming home." Jonathan, the youngest, clutched his journal against his chest and whispered, "All those years in the ministry, preaching about God's love, and I never understood what it meant. But she loved us enough to reach beyond death itself. How do we honor that? How do we become worthy of such sacrifice?" The three brothers spent the rest of the night in the cemetery, reading their mother's letters by lantern light. Eleanor had documented every milestone she imagined they would reach. Every birthday, every triumph, every heartbreak. She had poured her wisdom into those pages, offering guidance on everything from choosing a career to finding true love to raising children of their own. It was a lifetime of mothering compressed into written words, and each man wept as he discovered the parent he had unknowingly mourned his entire life. When dawn broke over Salem, the brothers carefully returned Eleanor's coffin to the earth, but not before each placed a rose inside, flowers they had picked from a bush growing wild near the cemetery gates. They filled in the grave with the same ceremonial precision they had used to open it, and then stood together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The immediate question was what to do next. They were three men in their 50s, each with established lives, families, and careers built on the foundation of lies their father had constructed. William's wife and children in Hartford believed he had suffered a mental breakdown. Thomas had burned bridges when he abandoned his business. Jonathan's reputation as a lawyer was destroyed by his sudden disappearance. But Eleanor's journals provided a roadmap for their future. Not specific instructions, but principles for living that were based on love rather than power, on connection rather than manipulation, on healing rather than harm. Over the following days, as they remained in Salem to plan their next steps, the brothers began to understand that their mother's true gift was not the supernatural compulsion that had brought them together, but the emotional intelligence that would allow them to rebuild their lives on a foundation of truth. William returned to Hartford, but not to resume his position at the bank. Instead, he used his savings to establish a fund for families facing foreclosure, turning his intimate knowledge of predatory lending practices into a tool for protection rather than exploitation. He reconciled with his wife and children by telling them the complete truth about his origins, and though the revelation was shocking, they found themselves relieved to understand the source of the restlessness that had always haunted him. Thomas liquidated his remaining assets and moved to Salem permanently, using his knowledge of shipping to establish a maritime museum dedicated to preserving the stories of ordinary sailors and their families. He never married, but he found peace in his work and in his regular correspondence with his newly discovered brothers. Jonathan faced the most difficult transition. His reputation in Vermont was irrevocably damaged, and his wife had filed for divorce during his absence. But he returned to face the consequences of his actions with a humility he had never possessed before. He made restitution for the church funds he had embezzled, worked as a clerk to pay his debts, and eventually established a small practice helping families with adoptions, using his legal knowledge to ensure that children were placed in loving homes rather than treated as commodities. The three brothers maintained their connection through weekly letters and annual visits to Eleanor's grave. Each October 15th, they would return to Greenlawn Cemetery, not to dig up the past again, but to honor their mother's memory and to reaffirm their commitment to living as the men she had hoped they would become. Their story might have ended there, a tale of supernatural intervention leading to personal redemption. But Eleanor had one more revelation waiting for them. In 1925, exactly 2 years after they had opened her grave, all three brothers received the same dream on the same night. They saw Eleanor standing in the library of the old Pembroke mansion in Salem, pointing to a wall lined with leather-bound books. Following this final vision, the brothers gained access to the mansion, which had stood empty since Jeremiah's death in 1903. Behind a false wall in the library, they discovered their father's private records, documents that revealed the full scope of his schemes. Jeremiah had not simply stolen his own children, he had been part of a larger conspiracy, a network of wealthy men who bought and sold children like livestock, placing them in homes where they would be raised to serve specific purposes. The records contained the names of dozens of other families, other children who had been separated from their birth parents and raised in lies. Some had been taken to be heirs for childless couples willing to pay enormous sums. Others had been placed in abusive situations where they would be broken down and rebuilt as servants or worse. The Pembroke brothers realized that their own rescue was only the beginning. Eleanor's love had reached beyond her own sons to encompass all the children who had been victimized by such schemes. Using the evidence they found in Jeremiah's records, the brothers spent the remaining years of their lives working to expose the network and reunite other families that had been torn apart by greed and manipulation. They established a foundation, funded by the sale of the Pembroke estate, dedicated to investigating cases of illegal adoption, child trafficking, and family separation. Their work was dangerous, as many of the conspirators were still alive and held positions of power, but Eleanor's spirit seemed to protect them, guiding them toward evidence, warning them away from traps, and giving them the strength to continue even when the horrors they uncovered threatened to overwhelm them. William died in 1934, collapsing of a heart attack, while testifying in a case that resulted in the conviction of 3 men involved in Jeremiah's network. Thomas followed in 1938, succumbing to pneumonia after spending weeks in the rain, searching for a missing child, who was ultimately found safe. Jonathan lived the longest, dying peacefully in 1941, surrounded by dozens of families he had helped reunite over the years. All 3 brothers were buried in Greenlawn Cemetery, their graves arranged in a semicircle around Eleanor's headstone. The cemetery workers reported that on quiet nights they could sometimes see 4 figures standing together near the Pembroke plots, 3 tall men and a woman in white, all of them glowing with soft light, all of them finally at peace. The foundation they established continued their work long after their deaths, evolving into a modern organization that investigates child trafficking and family separation around the world. And sometimes, when their investigators are working on particularly difficult cases, they report dreams of a woman's voice guiding them toward crucial evidence, or sudden insights that lead them to missing children, or an inexplicable sense of protection when they venture into dangerous situations. The story of the Pembroke family reminds us that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transcending death itself, and that even the most elaborate schemes of cruel men cannot ultimately triumph over the bond between a mother and her children. Eleanor Pembroke's love reached across decades and beyond the grave to reclaim her sons and transform them from instruments of their father's ambition into agents of healing and justice. In the end, the three men who stood in that cemetery on October 15th, 1923, digging up their mother's grave without understanding why, found far more than answers about their past. They found their purpose, their family, and their true selves. And Eleanor, who had endured years of imprisonment and died in sorrow, finally achieved her revenge, not through causing harm to those who had wronged her, but by transforming her stolen children into forces for good in a world that desperately needed their compassion. The coffin they opened that night contained more than a preserved body and a collection of letters. It held the key to their redemption, proof that love never truly dies, and the promise that no matter how far we stray from our true path, it is never too late to come home.